The human soldiers' attack was swifter and more brutal than the Benzites were prepared for. As the extremist gunman collapsed, Andrew stood over him, the Benzite's plasma rifle now clutched in the human's hands. The gathered crowd gasped in horror at the speed and ferocity of the human's violence. Andrew Henderson, 25, skilled soldier and member of Earth's first diplomatic mission to the Benzite homeworld, had reflexively done what he was trained to do: neutralize a deadly threat. But as he looked up at the shocked faces of the aliens around him, he realized his actions may have just made humanity's tenuous diplomatic position much worse. Stepping off the transport ship just minutes before, Andrew and his fellow human diplomats were greeted by the lead Benzite ambassador, Pryler. Even before the shooting began, Andrew couldn't help but notice the wary, even fearful looks many Benzites were giving the human arrivals. Under the facade of polite welcomes, a palpable tension hung in the air. Pryler had stiffly informed the humans of vague concerns among the Benzites about mankind's violent proclivities. He didn't get a chance to elaborate before plasma bolts began streaking towards the human delegation. Now, with the shooter subdued at Andrew's feet, Pryler rapidly ushered the shaken humans onto a transport, insisting they get to the safety of the embassy compound immediately. On the ride, he gravely informed Andrew that his act of fighting the gunman, while undoubtedly saving lives, would be seen by many Benzites as proof that humans were too inherently dangerous to engage with. Pryler explained that the Benzites had a cultural code of total nonviolence that had lasted for millennia. Even in the face of deadly threats, no Benzite would raise a hand in violence. Andrew's combat reflexes, as much as they had just helped prevent a massacre, had violated the highest laws of Benzite society. The humans' unease grew as they approached the isolated embassy compound on the outskirts of the capital city. High walls, armed guard towers, cameras, and defensive turrets encircled the compound, all tellingly pointed inwards at the human sector. Andrew exchanged grim looks with his fellow soldiers and diplomats as the reality sunk in. This was no embassy. It was a gilded cage, a glorified prison to contain the human threat. The soldier and Andrew chafed at being stuck behind walls and treated like an animal too dangerous to let free. The diplomat in him fumed at the irrational distrust and biases the Benzites clearly held towards humans. But beneath the anger, Andrew saw the fear and unease in Pryler's eyes, the same emotions reflected in the faces of every Benzite who had witnessed his lightning-fast, violent takedown of the gunman. On some deep cultural level, the humans terrified them. As Andrew settled into his quarters in what was clearly an internment camp, not a diplomatic compound, he reflected on the bitter irony. By acting on pure instinct to save Benzite lives, he had only confirmed their worst fears about human aggression and violence. But he had to find a way to change their perception of humanity. The future of the Alliance could depend on it. Otherwise, all his combat skills would be useless as humans rotted behind these walls, the last place in the universe that mankind was allowed to fight. Days dragged by in the oppressive confines of the human compound. Andrew paced the halls, his frustration mounting with each step. The Benzites' distrust hung heavy in the air, a palpable weight pressing down on the human delegation. Finally, unable to bear the tension any longer, Andrew requested a meeting with Ambassador Pryler. The Benzite arrived at the compound, his posture stiff and his eyes wary. They sat across from each other in the sparse meeting room, an uncomfortable silence stretching between them. "Ambassador," Andrew began, his voice carefully measured, "we need to find a way to bridge this divide between our people. The incident at the spaceport was a misunderstanding, a clash of cultural instincts, but surely we can move past." A deafening explosion shattered the air, the shockwaves slamming into the compound walls. Alarms blared as Andrew and Pryler were thrown to the ground. Dust and debris rained down around them. "What the hell was that?" Andrew shouted, already on his feet and running for the door. Outside, chaos reigned. A massive hole had been blasted in the outer wall, and through the breach poured a horde of armed Benzites. They wore the black fatigues of a militia, their plasma rifles spitting deadly fire as they stormed the compound. "It's Kirloch," Pryler gasped, his face ashen. "A warlord, a fanatic. He's sworn to eradicate the human presence from our world. Andrew's teeth gritted as he watched the militants pour into the compound, cutting down the few Benzite guards who stood in their way. His hand dropped to the pistol at his hip, muscle memory taking over. "Andrew, no!" Pryler pleaded, grabbing the human's arm. "You mustn't fight back. It will only confirm their worst fears about your kind." Andrew hesitated, torn between his instinct to defend and the knowledge that more violence would only make things worse. But as plasma bolts streaked past his head and the screams of the wounded filled the air, he knew there was no choice. "I'm sorry, Ambassador," he said grimly, pulling free of Pryler's grasp, "but if we don't fight now, we die." He sprinted out into the chaos, rallying his fellow soldiers with shouts and hand signals. They took up defensive positions, their weapons barking in controlled bursts as they sought to repel the Benzite militants without inflicting lethal wounds. In the midst of the firefight, a flash of movement caught Andrew's eye. A group of Benzite children, caught in the crossfire, huddled in terror behind a low wall. Their teacher crouched over them, trying in vain to shield them from the bullets and plasma blasts streaking overhead. Andrew didn't hesitate. He broke from cover, sprinting across the open ground as projectiles whipped past him. Reaching the children, he gathered them close, ushered them and their teacher towards the central bunker. A plasma bolt seared past his cheek, the heat blistering his skin. Andrew returned fire, dropping the Benzite militant with a precise shot to the leg. All around him, his fellow soldiers fought with unshakable focus, driving the attackers back with a disciplined display of non-lethal force. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of chaos and smoke, Kurlock's forces broke and retreated. Andrew sagged against the bunker wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Around him, the compound lay in ruins, but incredibly, no Benzites had been killed in the fighting. Ambassador Pryler approached, his face a mask of shock and confusion. He surveyed the scene, taking in the wounded militants, the terrified children, and the human soldiers standing resolute amidst the destruction. You didn't kill them," he whispered, his voice tinged with wonder. "Even after all this, you showed restraint, and you saved our children." Andrew met the Benzite's gaze, a flicker of hope kindling in his chest. "This is what humans do, Ambassador. We protect the innocent, even at risk to ourselves. Maybe now your people will see that we're not the monsters they fear." Pryler was silent for a long moment, contemplating. Then slowly he nodded. "I will bring you before the council," he declared. "You will speak, and they will listen. Perhaps there is still a chance for peace between our kinds." But as they made their way back to the Benzite capital, Andrew's heart sank. The streets were filled with angry civilians, their faces twisted with hatred and fear as they hurled insults and debris at the human convoy. Vidscreens flashed with images of the compound battle, but twisted and distorted by Kurlock's propaganda. The warlord's voice boomed from speakers, painting Andrew and his fellow humans as crazed brutes, sowing seeds of xenophobic rage among the populace. As he stepped out of the transport to a barrage of jeers and taunts from the crowd, Andrew realized the true battle for peace was just beginning. Kurlock's lies were spreading like wildfire, and the Benzites seemed all too eager to embrace their fear of the alien humans. Pryler led Andrew through the angry mob, his head held high in defiance. But beneath the diplomat's stoic exterior, Andrew could see the doubt and anxiety in his eyes. The council chambers loomed ahead, an imposing spire that seemed to pierce the sky itself. Andrew drew a steadying breath as he approached the doors, knowing that the fate of billions could rest on his next words. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different path. A path where Kurlock's hateful rhetoric won out, where the Benzites gave in to their worst instincts and humanity was once more alone among the stars. But then he remembered the children he had saved, the look of gratitude and wonder in their eyes as they realized a human had risked everything to protect them. And he knew, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he would walk it. For them, and for the hope of a better future for both their peoples. Andrew Henderson stepped out of the transport, his boots crunching on the debris-strewn street. The cacophony of angry voices hit him like a physical force. Benzites packed the thoroughfare, their faces contorted with fury as they shouted and shook their fists at the approaching human. "Murderer! Go back to your violent world. We don't want your kind here." The insults rained down, interspersed with chunks of rubble that clattered against the pavement around Andrew's feet. He glanced at Ambassador Pryler, noting the Benzites' tense posture and wide eyes. "We need to turn back," one of Pryler's security team hissed. "It's too dangerous." Andrew shook his head. "No, if we run now, Kurlock wins." He pushed forward, shouldering his way through the press of bodies. The crowd's hostility intensified, hands grabbing at his clothes, faces twisted in hatred inches from his own. A rock struck his shoulder, then another glanced off his temple. Blood trickled down the side of his face, but Andrew didn't flinch. Reaching the steps of the council hall, he turned to face the seething mass. A security officer thrust a bullhorn into his hands. Andrew raised it to his lips, his voice booming out over the din. "People of Benzar, hear me. You've been lied to about what happened at the embassy." The crowd's roar subsided slightly, curiosity momentarily overriding anger. Andrew pressed on, recounting the attack in vivid detail. The explosion that rocked the compound, the militants pouring through the breach, the terrified children caught in the crossfire. "We used non-lethal force to defend ourselves and your people," he explained, his voice raw with emotion. "I carried those kids to safety myself, with plasma bolts burning the air around us. We're not the monsters Kurlock claims we are." As Andrew spoke, Pryler darted to a nearby control panel. With a few deft movements, he patched Andrew's words into the city's public broadcast system. The human's impassioned plea echoed from speakers throughout the capital. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the crowd. Andrew saw confusion replace rage on some faces, while others engaged in heated debates with their neighbors. He opened his mouth to continue, but a sudden commotion erupted to his left. 3 black-clad figures pushed to the front, raising odd-looking weapons. Before Andrew could react, crackling blue energy lanced out, catching him in the chest. His muscles seized as the stun blast coursed through him, but years of training took over. He dropped and rolled, coming up in a crouch as 2 more blasts scorched the air where he'd been standing. In a fluid motion, Andrew closed the distance to the nearest attacker. He trapped the Benzite's weapon arm, using the alien's own momentum to flip him to the ground. A precise strike to a nerve cluster left the militant paralyzed but unharmed. The second attacker swung wildly with his weapon. Andrew ducked under the blow, jabbing 2 fingers into a pressure point on the Benzite's neck. The alien's eyes rolled back and he crumpled. Spinning to face the third militant, Andrew found him already unconscious, felled by a member of Pryler's security team who had finally sprung into action. A hush fell over the crowd as Andrew straightened, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He hadn't drawn his sidearm or struck a single blow. The Benzites stared in stunned silence at this display of skill and restraint. He didn't hurt them," someone murmured. "But Kurlock said humans only know violence," another voice argued. The crowd erupted into chaotic debate. Andrew caught snatches of conversation, some still spewing hatred, but others questioning everything they'd been told about humans. A hand gripped his arm. Pryler was at his side, urgency written across his features. "Now's our chance," the ambassador said. While they're distracted, they sprinted up the steps of the council hall. The massive doors swung open, then slammed shut behind them, muffling the tumult outside. Andrew found himself in a cavernous chamber, ringed by tiered seating. Dozens of Benzite counselors stared down at him, their expressions a mix of fear, curiosity, and barely concealed hostility. Pryler guided Andrew to the center of the room. "Esteemed members of the council," the ambassador announced, "I present Andrew Henderson of Earth. He wishes to address you regarding recent events and the future of human-Benzite relations." Andrew stepped forward, acutely aware of the weight of the moment. The fate of 2 species might hinge on what he said next. He took a deep breath and began to speak. Andrew stepped forward, his heart pounding. The council chamber fell silent, all eyes fixed on the lone human. "Esteemed council," he began, his voice steady despite the tension. "I stand before you to tell the truth about what happened at our embassy." He recounted the attack in vivid detail. The explosion that rocked the compound, Kirloch's militants pouring through the breach, plasma bolts searing the air. "We acted only to defend ourselves and your people," Andrew explained. "Our orders were clear: use non-lethal force whenever possible." He described disarming attackers with precise strikes, stunning others with low-powered shots. Then he paused, his expression softening. "But the moment that mattered most came when I saw a group of Benzite children huddled behind a low wall, their teacher trying to shield them as the battle raged." Andrew's voice grew quiet. "I didn't hesitate. I sprinted across open ground, plasma bolts whizzing past my head. I gathered those kids close and got them to safety." He nodded to Pryler, who activated a holoprojector. Footage from the embassy's security cameras flickered to life, showing Andrew's dash across the courtyard, scooping up terrified Benzite children as weapons fire erupted all around him. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the council. Andrew saw shock and confusion replace the hostility on many faces. Pryler stepped forward. "I witnessed these events myself," the ambassador declared. "This human risked his life to save our young. His actions fly in the face of everything we've been led to believe about their kind." The council erupted into heated debate. Some members, clearly swayed by Kirloch's propaganda, clung stubbornly to their prejudices. "It could be a trick," one shouted. "How do we know they didn't stage this footage?" But others were shaken, their certainty crumbling in the face of Andrew's evident bravery. An elderly Benzite rose slowly to his feet, silence falling as he spoke. "I am Councillor Torvin," he said, his voice quavering but firm, "and I am ashamed." Torvin's gaze swept the chamber. "We have judged these humans without ever truly attempting to know them. I move that we send a delegation to Earth itself, to observe their society firsthand and dispel our baseless fears." Before anyone could respond, the chamber doors burst open. A group of black-clad militants stormed in, weapons raised. "By order of Warlord Kirloch," their leader bellowed, "we are here to arrest the human and his conspirators for crimes against Benzar." Chaos erupted. Council members shouted in protest or approval. Andrew tensed, ready to fight, but Torvin's voice cut through the din. "You dare!" the old Benzite thundered. "This human defended innocent Benzite lives while under siege in his own embassy. He has shown more honor than you, who would arrest him on false charges." The militants hesitated, clearly unprepared for such resistance. Andrew saw his chance. In one fluid motion, he unholstered his sidearm, ejected the power cell, and set the weapon on the floor. "I volunteer to join your delegation to Earth," he announced, his voice ringing out. "Let me stand as living proof of humanity's peaceful intentions. Judge us fairly, with your own eyes." The chamber fell silent, all eyes on the unarmed human. Then Torvin nodded, a hint of a smile on his weathered face. "I second this proposal," the old counselor declared. Pryler stepped forward. "As do I," the ambassador added. "This human's courage may be the key to bridging the divide between our peoples." One by one, other council members voiced their support. The militants, outmaneuvered, retreated from the chamber. As the extended session drew to a close, Andrew found himself at the center of a flurry of activity. Plans were already being made for the Benzite delegation's journey to Earth. He caught Pryler's eye across the room. The ambassador nodded, a mix of hope and trepidation on his face. They both knew the real challenge was just beginning. The journey to Earth began with a tense atmosphere aboard the Benzite delegation's ship. Andrew Henderson stood alone in the hangar bay, watching the stars streak by through a small viewport. The hum of the engines vibrated through the deck plates beneath his feet, a constant reminder of the vast distance between him and home. Footsteps echoed behind him. Andrew turned to see Pryler approaching, flanked by two other Benzites with scowls etched on their faces. "I'm afraid we have a situation, Andrew," Pryler said, his voice tight. Some of the delegation are uncomfortable with your presence. One of the other Benzites stepped forward, eyes narrowed. We demand the human be confined for the duration of the voyage. He's too dangerous to allow free reign of the ship. Andrew's eyebrows furrowed, but he kept his voice level. I'm here as an ambassador of peace. Locking me up sends the wrong message. Peace, the Benzite spat. We've all seen the footage of your kind in battle. You're bred for violence. Heated voices filled the hangar as more of the delegation arrived, drawn by the commotion. Some defended Andrew, while others hurled insults and demands for his imprisonment. Pryler raised his hands, trying to calm the crowd. Please, let's discuss this rationally. We can't give in to fear and prejudice. An elderly Benzite pushed through the throng. Andrew recognized him as Counselor Torvin from the hearing on Benzar. Enough! Torvin's voice cut through the din. This human risked his life to save our children. He deserves our trust, not our suspicion. The arguments continued, growing louder and more heated. Andrew stood silent, acutely aware that his every move was being scrutinized. Finally, after what felt like hours, a compromise was reached. Andrew would be allowed to move about the ship, but only after surrendering all of his technology. I'm sorry, Pryler said, as Andrew handed over his communicator and other devices. It's the best we could do. Andrew nodded, resigned to his isolation for the long journey ahead. Days passed in uneasy quiet. Andrew spent most of his time in his quarters or wandering the less populated areas of the ship, always under the wary gaze of the Benzite crew. He was in the mess hall when the first blast rocked the ship. Alarms blared as Andrew sprinted for the bridge, dodging panicked Benzites in the corridors. He burst onto the command deck to find chaos. Through the view screen, he saw a sleek fighter weaving through their defensive fire, its hull shimmering as it phased in and out of view. Shields at 60%, a crewman shouted. We can't get a lock on the target. Another blast shook the ship. Sparks erupted from a nearby console as a Benzite officer was thrown to the deck. It's one of Kirlock's ships, Pryler said, his face ashen. They must have followed us. The enemy fighter swooped in for another attack run. This time, a torpedo struck home, tearing through the hull near the bridge. Klaxon screamed as emergency force fields snapped into place, barely containing the explosive decompression. Andrew's training kicked in. He sprinted to a nearby storage locker, yanking out an emergency force field suit. As he activated the skin-tight energy barrier, he saw cracks spreading across the bridge viewport. Everyone out, he yelled, gesturing toward the exit. I'll seal the breach. Before anyone could object, Andrew charged into the corridor beyond the bridge. The hull ruptured with a deafening roar, debris and atmosphere venting into space. Andrew fought against the vacuum, using every ounce of his strength to reach the gaping hole. With practiced movements, he activated the suit's repair protocols. A stream of nanites flowed from his gloves, racing to patch the breach. Andrew's muscles strained as he held himself in place, feeling the pull of the void. Finally, the hole sealed. Andrew sagged against the bulkhead, gasping for breath, but before he could move, another direct hit sent the ship lurching violently. The force threw Andrew off his feet. He tumbled through the newly repaired section of hull, which crumpled under the impact. Suddenly, he was adrift in space, surrounded by a halo of debris from the crippled Benzite vessel. Andrew activated his suit's maneuvering thrusters, desperately trying to regain control. He could see the airlock, tantalizingly close, but each burst from the thrusters sent him spinning in the zero-G environment. Through his suit's comm system, he heard the panicked voices of the Benzite crew. They had spotted him on the external cameras, a tiny figure tumbling against the star-filled backdrop. Andrew's fingers found the throttle controls for his suit's more powerful jetpack. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for one last push towards safety. But before he could fire the thrusters, a massive shape decloaked beside him. Andrew's blood ran cold as he saw the heavily modified transport ship filled with weapons. Kirlock's forces had arrived in force. Plasma bolts lanced out from the enemy vessel, streaking past Andrew's tumbling form. He watched in horror as they converged on his position, knowing there was nowhere to hide in the empty void of space.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.